Well, welcome to the second PEFM seminar of the term. Delighted to have Sean Hagan here with me, a friend and former colleague. Sean, as many of you know, was until last autumn the chief counsel for the IMF, as well as the head of the legal department, which he was heading for 14 years. Previously was overall in 28 years at the IMF. Sean has a BA in history from King's College London, has an MSc in international political economy from the London School of Economics, has a Juris Doctor from Georgetown, so there's high academic background, then was in private practice in New York and Tokyo before joining the fund. We worked together 20 years ago in Indonesia. I was doing the banking work and Sean the legal work. We're in basically a banking system full of KKN, which is the Indonesian acronym for corruption, nepotism, and whatever the other K was. It's something, kleptocracy, corruption, kleptocracy. KKN was the thing, no more KKN. And you had sort of basically a legal system from the Dutch colonial system which is not fit for purpose. So we both had a lot to do in those.
Collusion.
Collusion.
Which has a broader
concept. That's right. Corruption, collusion, nepotism.
Yeah. Obviously they don't have the corner on collusion.
That's right. That's it. So exactly. Anyway, since then, I mean, Sean has published very widely, and his work is partly doing the law of international governance and how the IMF is affected by international law, but also more broadly international financial law, mitigating the legal aspects of financial crises, particularly insolvency, which has been a major point. Sean is here, he's now at Exeter College, Oxford, for the year prior to next year being at Georgetown University, where he will be giving 3 lecture courses on international governance, on financial markets, financial sector restructuring, bankruptcy, and so on, and on corruption. And corruption is the subject we'll be talking on today. Again, this is, I know, one of Sean's interests over the years is corruption and ethics and so on. One of the ways in which the fund has changed, if people knew it 20 years ago, the annual meetings were sort of a mixture of tedious affairs of us workers working in back rooms, seeing endless people, whilst the junketeers, the private sector, would have these mega parties, and the press would therefore claim that the IMF is having these mega parties. I think the privateers types have gone a bit more discreet. But what's happened is that now the IMF takes over George Washington University campus, which is adjacent to it, and has this fantastic series of lectures, really top qualities, if anyone's ever in Washington around the time of the annual meeting, it's worth going there. And one of the most memorable ones I ever attended to was Sean basically showing his chairmanship when he was discussing ethics, and he had on this panel the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's not your grandfather's IMF. It's when you're sort of hosting. Yeah. But anyway, I hand over to Sean. I'm very happy to have you.
So Charles, it's great to be here and to be here with you chairing. I have a lot of fond memories of our work together in Indonesia, and actually I'm going to bring that up in the course of my remarks. So, corruption is a problem which has a number of different dimensions. I mean, clearly one of the most obvious is the moral dimension, and it's one that is emphasized by a number of the high-profile cases that we've seen in the last few years, where there's been justifiably, incredible outrage. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be looking at really the broader economic, social, and political dimensions of corruption, and why it's been relevant increasingly to the IMF's work. As you know, the IMF is both a financial and a regulatory institution, and stated broadly is there to basically help countries promote policies that support sustainable growth and financial stability. And over the years, it has become increasingly clear that systemic corruption undermines the capacity of countries to basically, achieve stability and also sustainable growth. Let me start off. Lawyers tend to do this, so apologies, but it's important to get this out of the way. Let me start off a little bit with a couple of definitional issues. There is I think there's a general acceptance of a definition of corruption, which is abuse of public office for private gain. Okay? And there's a couple of points that I want to make to this definition because it helps illustrate some of the issues. The first is that, what is abuse of public office? Well, every country in the world accepts that if it's criminal activity, if it's bribery, embezzlement, that type of corruption, that's corruption and that has to be prosecuted. However, as we all know, you can have public office compromised by private interests in a manner that doesn't quite rise to the level of criminality. And that is very much the case in the political sphere. We talk in the United States, we talk about legalized corruption in terms of electoral finance. So there is this issue about to what extent are we just talking about criminality or something broader? That's the first point. The second is the concept of public office. Clearly here we're talking about officials who exercise public authority and their abuse. We're not talking about fraud between two private actors. Now, it doesn't mean that the private sector is not relevant because for every bribe a public official takes, one is given by a private individual. So the solution has to involve basically sanctioning the private actors as well because they're part of the equation. But there's a big discussion as to whether or not we should also look at purely private transactions. And the fund actually has come to the conclusion that it has to. Why? Look at the financial crisis. In some respects, the 2008 financial crisis was a product of fraud within the private sector, or at least a degree of recklessness, which the Archbishop of Canterbury actually said, was unethical. But we don't call that corruption. We look at it. It is becoming an area of increasing importance, but we don't call it corruption because I think the general sense is that you need to talk about the public sector. Let's start then with abuses in the public sector. Why is it and when is it that this becomes a problem? The first point I want to make is that every country in the world, even Denmark, experiences corruption. We're not talking about isolated instances of corruption. We're talking about where corruption becomes systemic. In other words, where it becomes not the exception to the norm, but the norm itself. And there's a considerable amount of consensus, both among political scientists, and lawyers, and economists, that when you have corruption that is systemic, it does undermine the capacity of the state to perform some of its key functions. So let's talk a little bit about what those functions are. One of them, Adrian Chisi, my former colleague, is here, is the fiscal function. The ability of the state to raise revenues through tax and to spend it. Well, there's a lot of studies that have been done which demonstrate that when you have pervasive corruption in tax administration, it undermines the legitimacy of the tax system, and the ability of the state to raise financing is considerably diminished. We've seen that, and it can result in unsustainable fiscal situation and instability. Many people view the Eurozone crisis in part being a function of tax evasion where the officials involved were complicit. But even more so than that is on the expenditure side. There is a problem when you have systemic corruption. And it's not just a function of the waste, when you have procurement systems where there's conflicts of interests, where there's not really competitiveness and you get waste of resources and kickbacks. It's more, I think, the concern about the distortion of the spending priorities. if you have a systemically corrupt administration, there will be a tendency to finance large infrastructure projects that generate kickbacks, rather than expenditures that we all know are important for sustainable growth, health, education. And there's considerable evidence that shows actually, because of this distortion of priorities in public spending, the poor rely more on that than anyone else, and countries that are systemically corrupt, not surprisingly, there is a degree of inequality that you find there that is highly correlated to corruption. Okay? So it exacerbates poverty, inequality, and but even more broadly, one of the things, and obviously this is more anecdotal than anything else, is that it begins to have an impact on things as basic as education. In societies where what's important is not what you know, but who you know, the interest and the incentives for people to pursue higher education is diminished. And of course, we all know that it can result in considerable social instability and even military conflict. If you listen to people who were talking about what motivated them in the Arab Spring, it was the sense of essentially a distortion of the function of public sector. So, the other area that I want to focus on, because I think it's often misunderstood, is the state as a regulator. So the state not only has a fiscal function, it also is a regulator. And there clearly, when you have situations where basically officials use their authority to grant licenses, to grant permits, and use that as a way of extracting rents, as the economists would say, extracting bribes. It's not only, it doesn't just make investment more expensive. What's much more important is it makes it much more uncertain, because you can't enforce a bribe. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty when a foreign investor, for example, has to, let's say, make a very significant capital investment in an oil refinery, and knows that not only will it have to basically pay a bribe to get the permit, but it may have to pay a bribe to the life of the project after it's sunk that amount of money. The uncertainty will often deter the investor from making the investment in the first place. And I know there's this myth that the private sector likes corruption, and there's an expression, I think, the only thing worse than a corrupt, inefficient government is a clean, inefficient government, because you can't get things done. I really think that is a myth. You talk to most CEOs, they do want a level of predictability, and basically corruption, by definition, creates uncertainty, because you really are at the whim of abuse of authority. But although people focus on that aspect of the abuse of regulation, there's another one that is, in some respects, as important. And here, the pressure on corruption is not coming from the public official, but is coming from the private sector. And some political scientists and economists have labeled this as state capture, where you have powerful private interests who basically compromise the exercise of regulatory authority. And basically, as a result, you have ineffective regulation. And Charles, you remember in Indonesia, it was a classic example where you had connected lending and imprudent lending that occurred, which was at the heart of the crisis, because essentially private interests had basically used their wealth to compromise the bank regulators. So the reason why this is very different is because the policy response to the two are very different. In one case, you want to roll back regulation. In the other case, you actually want to strengthen it. So I think it's very important to be contextual about any policy discussion. And so let's talk a little bit then about what to do about it. When I started working in this area, and it was actually 20 years ago when I started doing corruption work in Indonesia, I did want to find a magic bullet because I felt that there had to be a single response, and I began to realize that that's an excessively simplistic way of looking at this issue. I think it was Einstein who said you should make things as simple as possible but no simpler. And I learned that the hard way, which is that actually you need to basically have an incredibly holistic and multifaceted approach. An obvious point is that corruption is not a crime of passion, it's a crime of calculation. So you need to basically look at changing the incentive structures. And a clear incentive for someone is the fear of prosecution, the credible threat of going to jail. And not surprisingly, people focus on that as being not the exclusive, but the principal way of addressing corruption. Rule of law, basically criminalization. The difficulty with this is that rule of law is not just about legislation. It requires the existence of institutions that basically will implement it. The police to investigate, the prosecutors to prosecute, and the judges to convict. And when you have a society that is systemically corrupt, often those are the three most corrupt institutions. So there is a problem with that, and therefore, if you are focusing very much on criminalization, you need to understand that you're talking about a long-term process. I'm not saying that you shouldn't focus on that, but you have to understand that it's a longer-term process. The other issue with looking at this exclusively through the lens of criminalization is that there's always a risk that an anti-corruption strategy is going to be hijacked for political purposes, where essentially the incumbent government uses its authority to investigate, prosecute, and convict the previous government. Right? So that's the other thing you need to be aware of when you're looking at this primarily in terms of criminalization. And the final thing that I want to say, and I have to be careful here because I don't want to be misunderstood, is that when corruption is systemic, looking at it exclusively in terms of criminality misses the point that in some respects, at that point, it's a collective action problem. It's not a function of individuals within a society who are doing bad things. Structurally, the whole society. There's a problem in terms of the way they understand their role. And to get someone to do the right thing is not just about threatening them with a sanction. It's basically trying to create a structural change, trying to change the norm of behavior, which requires a broader range of actions. So I think that there is a consensus. It's interesting. When I started developing this course, I started reading. As Charles will tell you, when we're in these crisis environments, we don't tend to read outside that much. We're so much focusing on finding a solution. And I was very happy to read that there is a broad recognition that you have to look at an anti-corruption strategy in terms of broader regulatory and administrative reform. You cannot just look at it in terms of criminalization. And what do we mean by broader regulatory and administrative reform? Well, regulatory reform. Clearly, in many countries, the reason why you have, for example, in India, to open up a small retail store, you might need to have 8 or 9 licenses and permits, I can't remember the exact number, is because it provides an opportunity for corruption. So often regulations and a regulatory environment exists, not exclusively, but often because it provides opportunities for rent seeking, okay? So in this case, rolling back that type of regulation is good in and of itself because it's stifling economic activity, but it also is a great way of addressing corruption. Other regulatory reforms that have been successful, for example, in Georgia and others, is the use of technology, where you have simple licenses and permits to basically do it online and remove basically the human interaction that often is the basis for extracting of bribes. However, as I've indicated before, in many countries the problem is not that it's regulatory authority gone amok, it's that the regulation is not effective enough because of state capture. And there, the policy response has to actually be to strengthen the regulation. For example, in the area of financial regulation, Charles will know this better than me, you need to basically make sure that you have a supervisor that is sufficiently staffed, independent, and that you have a financial regulatory system that really cracks down on, for example, connected lending. Okay? Because that's often where corrupt transactions take place. So, you know, there's a broad range of regulatory reforms, and, you know, at some point, it does require you to go really into the weeds to basically come up with solutions that work for a particular country. Another area that's related to regulation is transparency. I mean, corruption by definition, because it's generally criminal, you know, takes place behind the scenes. And one of the ways of basically preventing corruption is to introduce transparency. Grand corruption, which is corruption which involves embezzlement by senior officials, clearly to the extent to which you have effective and robust public finance management, financial transparency, where essentially the records of both the expenditures and revenues are consolidated, made public, and is subject to audit, is an important step forward, and the fund has done a lot of work in this area. Adrian could perhaps talk more than I can on that. But transparency also works in a very micro level. I mean, I remember when I was working in Indonesia, it was a reform that we introduced, and it was one of the most, we realized later it was one of the most effective reforms we did. There was a tremendous problem with corruption in the judiciary. And the authorities introduced a reform. It became part of IMF conditionality, where judicial decisions had to be published, and dissenting decisions were allowed. They were not allowed before, and should be published as well. That had a very important effect on the quality of decisions that we got in Indonesia. So transparency, I think, is very helpful. A final area that I would mention is administrative reform. I mean, you know, in the final analysis, what you're looking for is somehow to build up a civil service that is sort of proud of its independence from private influence and public interference. How do you do that? Well, you know, it's not just by threatening to put them in jail. In some cases, you have to pay them properly. In some countries, corruption is not an act of criminality, it's an act of survival. So you need to basically have a living wage for public officials, but you also have to have an effective performance management system with dismissals, and the two have to operate together. One of the more effective corruption reforms was in Georgia, in the police, where essentially they dismissed a significant portion of the police force, didn't prosecute them, but just dismissed them, and then essentially raised the salary considerably for those that were retained. So I think administrative reform in the civil service is very important. I want to just identify what I generally refer to as some myths about corruption, which I don't think hold water, at least based on my own experience working on this for the last 15 to 20 years. One of them is that corruption is inherently cultural. Some countries are just more corrupt than others, for cultural reasons, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, at one level that is true, in as much as what is cultural? Cultural are social norms, and to the extent to which corruption becomes a norm of behavior, it becomes embedded in the culture. Where I disagree is the notion that you can't change it. And history shows us that you can change it. One of the most corrupt civil services that ever existed was the United States in the 19th century. Okay? And it was not until the late 19th century, 20th century, that it became a very meritocratic civil service. Singapore was one of the most corrupt countries in the world until it obtained, well, one of the most territories until it obtained independence and Lee Kuan Yew introduced its reform. So what is the catalyst for change? I think this is really an interesting point. In some cases, it's a crisis that leads to social and political realignment. That surely was the case in Indonesia. Yes. That surely was the case in Indonesia. Charles and I were there during that period, and as he said, KKN, corruption, nepotism, and collusion were the driving force behind it. And when Bambang Yudhoyono came in as the first directly elected president, he launched and so he knew that electorally it made sense for him. Leadership also plays a critical role. In the case of Singapore, I think that, without Lee Kuan Yew, we would have had a very different story. In the United States, what is it that resulted in the civil service becoming meritocratic? Effectively, it was private industry. Private industry wanted to have effective services. And they were tired of having a post office that was run by the nephew of one of the senators or whatever. So there was a push for more effective services by industry. So another myth about corruption is that democracy is always a powerful anti-corruption force. Now, in some cases, that is true. Indonesia is an example. And in other cases, however, I don't see it. I mean, for example, in India, corruption has coexisted with democracy for many years. And in some cases, I think it can be argued that democracy actually exacerbates corruption. There is a very specific reason why in the 19th century the US civil service was corrupt. Political candidates would buy votes by giving them jobs. That's how it worked. And there are some countries where that continues to be the case. In the US now it's a very different problem. You don't have politicians bribing their voters. Some would say you have the voters bribing the politicians. But you need to understand that there are countries where democracy can be an engine for corruption and can be a reason why a country's public sector continues to grow. Because you need to have public sector jobs to give to people in exchange for votes. So, until now, I focused on the country, addressing systemic corruption, on addressing it in those countries. But as I said, there's a supply and a demand side to corruption. For every bribe that is taken, one is offered. And clearly there's a recognition that if you're going to address corruption, you need to actually also look at where the money is coming from. And often, it's coming from foreign investors. And therefore, countries that might be relatively corrupt-free themselves are part of the problem. The United States, the UK, and other large financial and industrial centers that basically are homes for multinationals who do a lot of investment, they are part of the problem. And I think they recognize that. There's a growing recognition that this is part of the problem, this is what they call the supply side. And so therefore, the good news is that there's been a lot of steps taken to establish international conventions. The OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which the US, the UK, and other OECD countries are signatory to, which criminalize the bribery of foreign officials. And it's modeled after the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and the U.S. has been extraordinarily active about that. That's the good news. The other one is on the other end. Imagine you have a corrupt transaction. The public official in a country gets the bribe. They generally will not deposit their money in their own banks. They will send it to a financial institution overseas. So a big push has been to make that more difficult by requiring transparency on the beneficial ownership of those accounts. And that's being done through the Financial Action Task Force and money laundering. Right? So we have an infrastructure that looks at this supply side and concealment. The difficulty is that, at least in the concealment side, the problem is implementation. You may remember the Panama Papers scandal, offshore financial centers where all these money is being held in these opaque companies where you don't know who the beneficial owner is. Well, in fact, there's a general recognition that in this respect, one of the worst financial centers is the United States, because they do not have a robust regime on transparency and beneficial ownership. So this is not just a problem in Panama, Netherlands, Antilles. It's still a global problem. I'd like to just conclude with a comment about fraud within the private sector. Why should we care about this? And as I indicated, we should think about the financial crisis that occurred. And I think there's a general recognition that the crisis was caused by a lot of unethical practices, mis-selling mortgages, and Charles mentioned this panel I moderated. It had Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Mark Carney was on it, and Christian Lagarde. And one of the concepts that we just explored was, what do we mean by unethical? Normally you think of unethical as being, fraud. But the point that Welby pointed out, which I think is well taken, is that when you act recklessly, when you take risks that in retrospect were completely reckless, and your decisions can have a huge impact on society, that's unethical. So, and there was a lot of recklessness in the financial services industry in terms of some of the financial decisions that were taken. So, what do we do about that? Well, as in the public sector, you look at the incentive structure. There's been a lot of changes to the rules regarding minimum capital and reform of the supervisory frameworks that are designed to address that. Also, there is some degree of a criminal enforcement on fraudulent acts, although one of the complaints has been that criminalization as a result of the financial crisis and also sanctions has been conviction of companies, but not individuals. And the problem with criminal convictions of companies is that it results in a fine, and there's a concern that this is just looked as being the cost of doing business, and that the only way you're really going to change behavior is to actually prosecute individuals. But I think there's even a larger issue, which we explored when we had this panel, which is that if when you're dealing with this, if you focus exclusively on affecting incentives through changing regulations and rules, you end up coming up with a culture of compliance. And the problem is that these rules can be circumvented. We've seen that. And what you want is really a culture of values, where you essentially have people who are doing the right thing even though no one's watching. So the question is, how do you create a culture of values? Now, this is obviously not something that the IMF is going to be taking the leadership in, but there is some interesting work that's being done in this area, in particular, for example, making ethics compulsory courses at business schools. I remember when I went to law school in the early 80s, there had been a major reform because of Watergate. because there was a sense that basically a lot of the lawyers had misbehaved, and therefore ethics became mandatory at law school. I have to tell you, it was an important course at Georgetown, and it did have an important effect in terms of raising people's understanding on these issues. So there is a push to make ethics a mandatory provision, and increasingly public officials talk about this. I don't know if any of you read the speech that Mark Carney did a couple of years ago when he talked about this. When he talked about the biggest problem in the financial services industry was the culture of compartmentalization. That people compartmentalized their business lives and separated them and their values and separated them from their personal lives. And that you needed to basically have a single set of values that governed both. It was quite bold for a governor of a central bank to talk about this. But, if you read Adam Smith, you get the same idea. Even though Adam Smith is sort of the father of laissez-faire economics, in fact, he thinks his greatest work was moral sentiments.
Yeah.
There are moral sentiments, and it's clear that when you read that, you realize that he understood economics as an extension of moral philosophy. So, you have the baker selling bread to the butcher. Well, the only reason why the butcher buys the bread from the baker is if he trusts the bread. And when you look at, in other words, there's trust. And actually credit, the Latin word for credit is trust. And if you look at what happened with the interbank market at the height of the financial crisis in 2008, the liquidity crisis was the fact that nobody trusted the collateral because nobody could value it, nobody understood it. So there was an absence of trust in the product. So this idea of, that concept being a part of the discussion, I don't think is something new. So I will just conclude by saying I think it's really important that as we engage in reform in this area, is that we need to look at not only looking at reforms of the regulatory, administrative, and legal frameworks, but also looking at ways to shift values. Thank you.